So another Blake video for the AQA political protest paper, and we can look here at some of those political concepts that might be demonstrated in the 3 poems we're going to look at in this video, and we can look to try and use some political language like that to explore the ideas in the poems. As ever, we want a key focus on methods. We might think about links between the poems, and that's going to be obvious between these 3, and obviously trying to always keep an eye on how the methods reveal the social and political methods and messages, rather than seeing those 2 things separate. Important thing to remember when you're writing essays about Blake is not to get caught up in dealing with individual lines and exploring individual metaphors or symbols abstractly, or sort of in a cut-off way from any idea or argument you might have in an essay. And that's why we would keep our focus on those key elements, which are the broad themes of the questions that have been asked so far. It's just a good way to keep our eye on what we're going to do with these poems, rather than just talk about the poems in isolation. Obviously, they're not going to exactly ask those questions again. It'll be a slightly different wording each year, but you can see that there's quite a consistent thread there. So, the first of our poems is The Divine Image. Now, this, not to be mistaken by A Divine Image, there's 2 poems, very similar titles. We're going to look at both, and the companion piece to this, The Human Abstract. So The Divine Image is in the Innocent selection, and it offers a list there of abstract concepts, ironically, but then says that these abstractions, these virtues, actually live inside human beings, that they only exist because human beings make these things happen. So it's the idea that heaven can be made on earth through human action. That when we pray to these abstract virtues, we can get some sort of response because a human being brings about those virtues in real life. So a human being brings mercy into the world, pity has a human face, love a human form, and peace human dress. These things only exist because human beings do something that qualifies under the term. The poem has a neat and clear structure. There's some evidence of rhyme, although it's rather broken up in that sense. We do get a neat sound rhyme at the end of the poem that sort of rounds it off very neatly. Otherwise, the sort of half rhymes, distress, thankfulness is a reasonable rhyme, dear care and face dress, not great, peace, distress, maybe divine climb, possibly some rhyme there, but not really. Mostly it's the 2nd and 4th lines that rhyme, with the repetition of love, love being not accidental. Love is probably the central key virtue amongst all the others, so that gets repeated in stanza 2. The poem resolves itself into something that's in favour of diversity and equality and an attack upon prejudice. So heathen, Turk or Jew, they're all equally human, equally open to these virtuous feelings, and should be treated with the same compassion, care and love. It's an innocence poem that seems to suggest that God is dwelling too. God is on earth in these good things, and there's a hope for us all in this poem that if we can act from these virtuous emotions, we have a good chance of creating this heaven on earth. So at the point of this poem's completion, everything seems very rosy, but of course that's your typical naive, innocent view, that the world is full of goodness and happiness and joy, and human beings are in harmony with God, and God is love, and love exists on the world. The human abstract, which is in the experience selection, much more complex and troubling poem, begins reasonably clearly, though, that it says that there would be no need for these virtues if the world were a better place. And that's the key to this poem, that the world ought to be this good. The world ought to be as good as the Innocence poem suggested it was, but it isn't. And that's why we do need mercy and pity and peace, because things aren't peaceful. The world is not full of mercy and goodness, and we pity people because they are suffering. And so it's that old question underlying the poem: why has God created this world full of all this suffering, that we need these compassionate feelings in the first place? And that's clear enough at the beginning, and then the poem, though, quickly spirals into something very densely symbolic, and there's been many attempts to interpret the symbolism of the poem. But ultimately, Blake is not given as a key to this, so he's allowing the reader to decide what he thinks happens here. What he talks about is that sort of mutual fear bringing peace, which is that idea of, well, yes, if we think of it on an international politics scale, two countries do not go to war with each other because they are frightened of the power of the other country to destroy them. But that's not, that's a tense standoff. It's not really peace, is it? It's kind of an absence of war up to a point, but with also always the possible threat that war could happen at any point if one or other of the fearful countries or leaders decides that there is an advantage for them. And then he tries to describe what happens because of that mutual fear that's bringing peace. And he talks about cruelty knitting snares and baits. So the imagery is now dense with unpleasantness, and it's the idea of trying to catch your enemy out. And it might recall a poison tree with the sort of fostered hatred that ultimately poisons and destroys the enemy in a more terrible way than the sudden outburst of anger might relieve. Here, again, a bit like a poison tree, a tree is grown out of this these unpleasant feelings. We get the holy fears there, which is a good Blakean term for what he thinks of religion as an organised force to be, really. Religion as an organised force is something that preys upon our fears by making us subservient to authority figures, by saying, really, you don't understand what the nature of the universe under God is. I, as a priest, will explain it to you. Don't ask too many questions. It's that kind of image that Blake has of the church, which he resents and protests about. So humility takes root under the foot, is that idea again of being sort of crushed by authority, by people who tell you that they know better. This dismal shade of mystery is the church telling you, you can't understand the Bible, you can't understand God's will and wishes, you need to listen to the priests. Caterpillars and flies seem to be images of possibly the priesthood, but so is the raven there, obviously in its dark feathers, like the dark vestments of a priest. And again, everything is full of deceit, deception, trickery. And this terrible sort of tree of deception grows ultimately, it says, in the human brain. The rhyme is much more noticeable here. It's rhyming couplets, and it's pretty consistent and good rhymes, and that really sort of adds a surprising order to a poem that is quite chaotic and troubling and hard to decipher. It seems quite neat if you just read it through the rhymes, and the rhymes certainly highlight what the key words are and what the message is. We've got words like deceit and vain, as in vanity, tears and fears, mystery, shade. These are all rhymed words that suggest the essence of the poem is about the truth being hidden from us, and that we have within us some kind of deception as well, growing within us, this sort of desire to be deceived or to deceive others. But the poem cannot, I don't think, be ultimately unpicked finally, and this is why it doesn't perhaps work as a protest poem particularly well, and this is something you could put into um, some of your arguments in your essays. That actually, if you want to call Blake a protest poet, you really only got maybe one or two poems where he directly protests, and in others, he confuses the issue with this dense and complex symbolism. You cannot march to this poem. You cannot plaster this poem on walls everywhere and expect everyone to go, oh yes, now I understand which way I should vote or what I should do, because it's too complex and dense, it's too cryptic. So the two poems together that we've looked at so far work as a nice pair. The very simple, optimistic view in the first poem, and now this troubled, complex and deceiving view in the second. There's no escape from constraints was one of our themes for our questions. Well, this poem seems to suggest that, the second poem particularly, that the constraints imposed by figures of authority in the church will ultimately put us in this dense and sort of complicated thicket of problems. They're not particularly about parenting, so perhaps not one that you would have used if that was your question, the 2018 question. But religion definitely here is portrayed in this poem in particular. And in the other two, there's an idea of the essence of religion and what it is. And the questions are being asked about the nature of reality under God, and whether God has created a good world or a world full of complexity and trouble, and whether we can trust the authorities of the church. The human spirit has the power to resist was another question. Well, there is a sense that some resistance is possible just by raising this problem. Certainly this is a resistant poem. Blake is resisting the forces of the church and the forces of mystery and the forces of deceit. But whether it's successful or not, it remains pretty ambiguous as the tree, this growth, remains inside the human brain at the end of the poem. Perhaps a bit like those mind-forged manacles from London. There's not much about personal relationships here, I don't think, but authority figures being unkind and showing no compassion are implied, and innocence leading to joy and happiness. Well, certainly that seemed to be the case in the first poem, but in the second, the density here has really destroyed the happiness. However, there is a third poem that links with these because it has a very similar name, A Divine Image. It was not in all copies of the volume. It was added to some copies of Blake's Songs of Experience. And here it just seems like a much more direct and simple refutation of the first poem, whereas the other one got caught up in that dense imagery. And sometimes I think, as in A Poison Tree and The Human Extract, I think in both cases Blake gets very agitated by his own imagery and his own symbol to the point of losing sight of what he's trying to say almost. Well, here he just goes very clearly and says, well, I've just said in the divine image that mercy, pity and peace are everywhere in the human form. Here I'm saying, no, all those opposite, much more unpleasant, much more dangerous and threatening emotions, these abstractions here, they're all in the human heart too. So you've got cruelty and jealousy and terror and secrecy. And we now get a little bit of imagery from the tiger with the forging in the fiery forge and furnace. So that it's an image of hatred and violence, and it's saying that the human being is actually tense with violence, tense with hatred, tense with a wish to destroy and threaten, and secrecy being a particular problem of the sick rose, for instance. And here again, it's a problem of hiding things, not being honest, not being open. Blake seems to prophesy a time of complete honesty and openness, if such a thing were possible. So here there is no escape from constraints, because we are dense with our unpleasantness. Here there is a religion that says there is no comfort and joy because the world is full of these miserable and terrible things. The marginalised are not going to be helped by anybody here because we're all too cruel and jealous and terrifying and secretive to do anything for anybody else. We're never going to put ourselves out here. And the human heart is a hungry gorge. A gorge as in sort of the idea of gorging yourself, filling your throat full of food. So you want to eat well, perhaps even cannibalize. You want to destroy and consume. And yeah, it's a good point for our 21st century consumerism, isn't it? That we are this hungry gorge. We are trying to consume the whole world in our pursuit for retail therapy. So there are no particular authority figures here, but or personal relations, but there's certainly no access to joy and happiness here. So the human spirit is resisting here in the sense that, again, Blake is being honest and open and exposing the horrors of the dark side of the human spirit. And perhaps that's the beginning of a resistance. This has a directness that the other poem, opposing the divine image, the human abstract, did not have a directness. And it's as if he wants to go back to it and say, no, I need to be really clear here that there's a problem, and we need to be really crystal clear in our exposing of that problem. We need to absolutely show that the world is full of these terrible things, and we have to address them and overcome them in some way. So he's getting closer to something like a very simple political protest of, we need to oppose cruelty and jealousy and terror and secrecy. And we need to stop consuming and stop hating and stop being selfish and cruel. And so this poem is a useful one to attack some of those themes that will most likely come up in a question on Blake on the paper. The 3 poems together show the complexity of Blake's vision, and that's something that you can always fall back on, that the questions, I think, often invite you to challenge the rather simplistic view with words like always and things like that say, as if we can sort of summarize Blake. One question had the word dominate in it. Well, nothing is dominant in Blake because he hates dominance. So these poems show together that they don't all solidify into a simple final statement of do this or believe that. They are complex and interwoven together in ways that ultimately end up with that complex image in the human abstract, which we can't simply decipher as to what caterpillars and ravens might possibly mean. However convincing the interpretations you might see online are, ultimately Blake is throwing a puzzle in our way there, not for us to give an answer to, but for to say that life is puzzling and troubling and not straightforward.